There is an assumption almost every person carries into a conversation about Satan. And it is so foundational, so embedded in the architecture of Western religious thought, that most people have never noticed it is an assumption at all. The assumption is this, that Satan is a continuous being, that the figure who appears in the book of Job is the same figure who whispers in Eden, the same figure cast from heaven in Isaiah, the same figure defeated at the end of history. One identity, one biography, one cosmic opponent running across 2 testaments and 3 millennia of theological tradition. The assumption feels so obvious, so self-evidently correct, that questioning it can feel less like scholarship and more like provocation. But the Hebrew Bible does not support that assumption. 3 of the most important appearances of the Word in the entire Old Testament share a function and nothing else. No name, no backstory, no memory of a previous meeting. The being who enters the divine court in Job has no history before that moment. Nothing in the text suggests he was elsewhere before the court session opened. The being who stands in Zechariah's post-exilic vision carries no trace of Job's encounter. He does not arrive trailing a biography. He is simply there, performing a function, in a court that requires that function to be performed. And the being who opposes Balaam in the wilderness holds no title, no office, no biography of any kind. He is a divine agent performing an act. The act has a name. The act is not yet the being. The word connecting them is not yet a name. In these early biblical uses, it behaves as a job description. And the distinction between those 2 things is the entire argument of this video. In the next hour, 3 distinct beings will be identified who held the same prosecutorial office at different times in different texts. Mastema in the book of Jubilees, Belial in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the unnamed adversary of Job's divine court. By the end of this video, you will understand the 5 specific historical stages through which these office holders, combined with the 5 beings identified in the previous episode and the later transformation of Lucifer into a proper name, established in episode 1, were fused into one continuous cosmic personality. And you will understand precisely what that fusion permanently destroyed in the theological record. This matters beyond the academy. The singular devil, most people inherited, is not simply a simplification of complex material. It is a specific claim about the nature of evil, that evil has one source, one intelligence, one biography that can be identified and opposed. The adversarial office framework destroys that claim entirely. If multiple distinct beings held the same prosecutorial role across different communities and different centuries, if the function was institutional rather than personal, then evil in the ancient texts has no sovereign. It has no coordinated plan. It has no single defeat condition. That is not a more sophisticated version of the same idea. It is a categorically different account of what evil is. One detail before we begin. At one specific point in the Hebrew Bible, God and Satan are recorded as the cause of the exact same event, not symbolically, not through allegory. The same act in 2 different books, attributed once to God and once to Satan. And neither text treats this as a contradiction. Hold that. The word ha-Satan in 3 of its most consequential early biblical uses is not a name. It is a job description. By the end of this chapter, you will understand what the prosecutorial office actually was. and why the single letter he prefixed to that word is the most important linguistic detail in this entire series. In classical Hebrew, the definite article, the prefix hae, equivalent to the in English, transforms a common noun into a specific designation. Satan, without the article, means an adversary in the generic sense. It can describe any opponent, human or divine, operating in any context. A human plaintiff opposing another in court can be described as a Satan. A military enemy blocking an advance can be described as a Satan. The word is functional before it is theological. Ha-Satan, with the article, designates something more specific. The adversary, the accuser, the one who performs the prosecutorial function in a defined institutional context. The distinction is not subtle. It is the difference between calling someone a judge and calling them the judge, between a title held temporarily and a name borne permanently. That distinction is the entire argument of this chapter, and it is worth holding precisely. The institutional context in which Hey Satan appears is the divine council. What scholars following the comparative work of figures like Michael Heiser have called the divine assembly, the heavenly court, the council of the sons of God. The Hebrew Bible preserves, particularly in its older textual strata, a theology of divine governance in which God functions as sovereign king surrounded by a court of heavenly beings, the Bene Elohim, the sons of God, serving various administrative and judicial functions in the governance of the created order. This is not peripheral theology. It surfaces explicitly in Psalm 82, where God presides in the divine assembly and judges the gods. It surfaces in 1 Kings 22, where a heavenly council debates the means of Ahab's downfall with various spirits offering different plans. It surfaces in Deuteronomy 32, in the older textual tradition preserved by the Dead Sea Scrolls and reflected in the Septuagint, where the nations are apportioned according to the sons of God or divine beings. The later Masoretic text reads, sons of Israel, likely reflecting a more cautious transmission of the older divine council image. The divine assembly is a structural feature of the Hebrew theological imagination, not a marginal curiosity, and within that assembly, as within any functioning court, roles are differentiated. There are those who serve, there are those who judge, and there is the one who accuses. The book of Job opens inside that court. Job 1:6 records that the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and among them came Satan. The text does not introduce him. It does not explain who he is or how he came to be there. There is no backstory, no origin, no indication that this is his first appearance in this role. He is simply present as a member of the assembly with a recognized function, and that function becomes clear immediately. When God draws attention to Job's righteousness, Hey Satan's response is not rebellion. It is a prosecutorial challenge. The piety is circumstantial, protected by divine favor rather than intrinsically genuine. Remove the hedge, and the man will curse God to his face. This is the language of a crown prosecutor cross-examining a witness statement. The claim is not that Job is guilty. The claim is that the evidence for his innocence has not been adequately tested. God grants permission. The adversarial process is initiated. What is happening here is not opposition to God. Ha-Satan in Job is performing a prosecutorial function within God's own court, with God's explicit permission, under conditions God himself sets. He is operating in the most precise, institutional sense as his role requires. The book of Job never suggests otherwise. The character who suffers is Job. The instrument of that suffering is Satan. The authorization for the entire proceeding comes from God. When the story ends, after 2 rounds of affliction, after the Comforter's discourse, after God's speeches from the whirlwind, after Job's restoration, Satan disappears from the narrative entirely. No punishment, no aftermath, no continuing role. The prosecutorial function was required. It was performed. The court session concluded. The prosecutor went wherever prosecutors go when the session ends. Zechariah 3:1-2 presents the same office in a different context and reveals something the Job text leaves implicit. The prophet sees Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, with Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. The Lord rebukes Satan directly. What follows is not an expulsion. It is not a judgment against the adversarial function itself. God rebukes Satan not for being present, not for performing an illegitimate function, but for prosecuting a case God has already decided to dismiss. The rebuke is procedural. The adversarial office's standing in the court is not challenged. Its conduct in this particular instance is overruled. A judge overruling a prosecutor is not evidence that the prosecutor has no legitimate function. It is evidence that the court works exactly as courts are designed to work, with checks on every role, including the prosecutorial one. Satan in Zechariah operates inside a fully functional system of divine governance. The system rebukes him. The system does not abolish him. Numbers 22:22 carries the logic of the office to its most transparent expression. The text records that the angel of the Lord stationed himself in the road le Satan to act as an adversary to Balaam, not to be the Satan, to perform the adversarial action, the verbal form. A specific divine agent, the angel of the Lord, performing the adversarial function without holding the title Satan as a permanent role. The act of opposing, blocking, functioning as an obstacle in the path of someone whose course requires redirection. This is the most primitive layer of the evidence. The verb precedes the title. The function is older than the office. The office is older than any figure who holds it permanently. Any divine agent can Satan because the adversarial function is intrinsic to the operation of divine governance, not the property of one being who monopolizes it. The first appearance in the Hebrew Bible of the word without the definite article, potentially as a proper name, is 1 Chronicles 21. It is late, post-exilic, composed several centuries after the Job and Zechariah texts, drawing on older source material, but reflecting a period when Jewish theology had been exposed to Babylonian and Persian religious frameworks during and after the exile. Even in that text, scholars debate whether Satan in 1 Chronicles 21:1 functions as a title or a proper name. The grammatical case is not settled, and the scholarly literature reflects genuine disagreement. What is clear is the direction of travel. Across the span of the Hebrew canon, a functional title is moving, slowly, unevenly, with no single moment of decisive transformation, towards the status of a personal name attached to a continuous being. The office did not belong to any particular being. This is the argument the three texts together make, and it is the argument that every subsequent chapter of this video builds on. The prosecutorial function was a feature of divine governance that could be performed by multiple agents, by the being in Job, by the being in Zechariah, by the angel of the Lord in Balaam's road, potentially by others whose appearances have not survived in the texts available to us. The office is structural. It is older than any of its documented holders. And there is, as noted at the opening of this video, one moment in the Hebrew Bible where the office and God Himself are so close in function that a later text simply substitutes one for the other without explanation and without apparent theological discomfort. That moment is where this video is heading. 2 Samuel 24 and 1 Chronicles 21 record the same event, the same king, the same census, the same catastrophic divine punishment falling on the same population. One of these texts attributes the instigation to God. The other attributes it to Satan. By the end of this chapter, you will understand what that substitution reveals about the adversarial office tradition, and why the explanations later interpreters have produced for the tension tell their own story. This is the anomaly named at the opening of this video. We are here. Open 2 Samuel 24. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he incited David to count the people. Now, open 1 Chronicles 21. Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to number Israel. Same king, same census, same consequence, different cause. Neither text pauses to explain the difference, which tells you something important. The substitution was not experienced as a contradiction by the people who preserved both accounts. What these two texts record is not a scribal error and not a theological contradiction. They record a worldview, one in which the adversarial function is so integral to the operation of divine governance that its agent and its ultimate source were, in the oldest stratum of the tradition, functionally the same thing. To understand why, it is necessary to think carefully about what the census represented within the theology of covenant kingship. David's decision to number the people was not administratively neutral. It was an assertion of autonomous royal power that bypassed the terms of the covenant, a king treating the people as his resource to quantify rather than God's people held in trust. The divine response to that transgression, whatever its mechanism, is the instrument by which the transgression is exposed, judged, and its consequences worked out. Whether we call that mechanism God incited or Satan incited, the theological structure is identical. A king acts in violation of covenant, and the divine governance of history responds. This is only possible within a theological framework in which the adversarial function is not opposition to God, but an expression of divine governance operating through a prosecutorial instrument. The Satan who incites David in Chronicles is not acting against God's will. He is acting as an agent of the consequences that covenant violation brings. The substitution works in the Chronicles account because the chronicler understood the adversarial office as so close to the operation of divine justice that attributing the incitement to Satan and attributing it to God were not different claims about what happened. They were different ways of describing the same causal mechanism from different perspectives on how divine governance operates. Later interpreters have proposed several explanations for the tension. Some argued that the Chronicles account corrects a theological difficulty in Samuel, that later scribes were uncomfortable with the directness of divine incitement and introduced an adversarial intermediary to create distance between God and the provocative act. Others argued that the Satan in Chronicles is acting as God's instrument, a subordinate agent whose action is still fundamentally God's action. Others still maintain that the divergence reflects two genuinely different theological schools, each preserving a legitimate understanding of how divine will operates in history. But the very variety of those explanations, and the fact that none has achieved consensus, suggests how strange the parallel becomes once Satan is read as God's independent enemy rather than an instrument of divine governance. The moment the Satan as cosmic rebel framework became theologically dominant, that ease became untenable. A being at war with God cannot be substituted for God in the same causal chain without destroying the entire architecture of cosmic opposition that the singular devil framework requires. Once the adversarial figure became a personality in permanent rebellion against divine authority, the first Chronicles text ceased to be a preserved theological complexity and became a problem requiring management. It is one of the clearest textual markers available for identifying the moment a theology changed, not because it was altered, but because the framework needed to read it had been. Mastema inherits the core functions associated with the job Satan: testing, affliction, accusation under divine permission. By the end of this chapter, you will understand why he is not the Job Satan under a different name, and why the book of Jubilees found it theologically necessary to give the adversarial office a permanent holder with his own biography, his own origin, and his own commission that does not expire when the court session ends. The obvious reading, and it deserves to be stated clearly because it carried scholarly weight for a long time, is that Jubilees is simply retelling the job framework with a name substituted. The structural parallel is undeniable and precise. Both figures receive divine permission before acting. Both afflict the righteous as a test of faithfulness. Both operate within the framework of divine governance rather than against it. If one were trying to minimize the theological disruption, the argument would be straightforward. Jubilees is a literary variation on a known template. Mastema is Ha-Satan under a different designation. And the essential theology is unchanged. It would tidy the picture considerably, and it would be wrong in a way that matters. Mastema does not share the Job Satan's origin because the Job Satan has no origin. The figure in Job 1 simply is a member of the divine assembly with a prosecutorial function whose prior history is neither provided nor apparently required by the text. The Job Satan is not introduced. He arrives. Mastema is explained. The Book of Jubilees, chapter 10, provides his genealogy with specificity. After the flood, when the Nephilim had been destroyed in the deluge, and the disembodied spirits of the slain giants remained in the earth, roaming, afflicting, leading astray. The angels appointed to bind them succeeded in imprisoning the vast majority. 9/10 of the spirits were confined. But Mastema came before God with a petition: allow him to retain authority over 1/10 of the spirits. Let them remain active under his command to afflict and mislead the children of men. God, according to Jubilees, granted it. The significance of this cannot be overstated. Mastema does not rotate into the adversarial function when the divine court requires a prosecutor. He holds it as a permanent, explicitly negotiated commission. He asked for it. God authorized it. The adversarial function has, in Jubilees, acquired a permanent holder, a being for whom the role is not a temporary appointment, but a defining identity. The office has stopped rotating. It has found a face. His genealogy deepens the distinction further. The Job Satan emerges from the divine court itself, his origin embedded in the heavenly institutional structure. Mastema emerges specifically from the aftermath of the Nephilim catastrophe, from the intersection of the Watcher transgression on Hermon and its physical consequences in the world of humanity. He does not come from the divine council's procedural history. He comes from a specific catastrophe with specific perpetrators and specific consequences that rippled forward into the world. His commissioning builds on an entire prior theological structure: the fall of the Watchers, the violence of the Nephilim, the flood as divine response, that the Job text knows nothing of. The two figures are not the same being in different literary costumes. They are beings with entirely different genealogies who happen to occupy the same institutional role. Jubilees 17 and 18 show Mastema, in his most recognizable guise, the testing of the righteous. And the structural echo of Job is deliberate. Mastema appears in Jubilees' retelling of the Akedah as the figure who initiates the trial. The binding of Isaac, framed explicitly in adversarial terms. The parallel to Job 1 is unmistakable. An adversarial figure operating within the framework of divine governance initiates a test of the righteous, and God permits the test. But where the Job Satan disappears from the text, the moment his prosecutorial function is complete, Mastema's role in Jubilees does not end with the Akedah. He is present in chapter 48 during the Exodus, actively working against the covenant people in the arena of historical events rather than the divine courtroom. The prosecutorial function has migrated. It is no longer confined to the divine court. It is operating in history, with a named permanent agent directing it according to his own continuing commission. His name encodes the shift. The root satam carries a meaning closer to enmity or sustained hostility than to the legal adversarial function of Satan. Where the Job Satan's name describes a role to oppose, to accuse, to act as adversary in the defined sense of legal process, Mastema's name describes a disposition, enmity, hatred, a character orientation rather than a court function. The office has not merely acquired a permanent holder. The permanent holder has begun to transform the office by the weight of his own nature. Mastema is not Satan. He is not Belial. He is a third distinct being standing at the precise moment of the office's transformation, the point where a rotating institutional function begins to accrete the features of a personal identity. The Book of Jubilees is not a confused text that conflates these figures. It is a precise text that records a specific theological development in progress. And in the Qumran texts, that same pressure moves in an even more cosmic and militarized direction. Belial in the Dead Sea. Scrolls is not a synonym for Satan. He is a distinct being, identified across the Qumran corpus with the angel of darkness, commanding the spirits of falsehood, whose existence in these texts reveals how far the adversarial office had traveled from the crown prosecutor of Job's divine court. By the end of this chapter, you will understand the final transformation before the medieval merger, and why Belial's theology represents the outer limit of what the Hebrew tradition could do with the adversarial function without crossing into genuine theological dualism. The community rule, known in the scholarly literature as 1QS, contains one of the most systematic theologies of the adversarial function preserved in the pre-Christian Jewish literature outside the Hebrew Bible itself. Its Two Spirits treatise divides not only the cosmos, but humanity into two fundamental categories, each governed by a distinct principle: the angel of truth, who rules over the sons of light, and the angel of darkness, Belial, who rules over the sons of darkness. These two principles are not equal and opposing cosmic powers in the strict metaphysical sense. The community rule is explicit that God created both spirits and that both operate ultimately within God's design. But functionally, in terms of how they operate on human consciousness and decision, how they distribute righteousness and wickedness across humanity, how they structure the moral landscape of every individual life. They are presented as symmetrical, opposing, and comprehensive. There is no aspect of human experience that lies outside their competing governance. This is not the divine court of Job, with one official playing a limited prosecutorial role. This is a cosmology in which the adversarial principle is woven into the structure of created existence. The War Scroll names him as a military commander, not a prosecutor, not a petitioner, a general, leading an army against the sons of light. The office has become a kingdom. The War Scroll, designated 1QM, describes an eschatological conflict between the sons of light, led by the archangel Michael, and the sons of darkness, led by Belial and the armies of the Kittim. The text is not symbolic or allegorical in the Qumran community's own understanding. They believe themselves to be living at the threshold of this final war. Belial is not a principle or a tendency. He is a military commander with a chain of command, a strategic role, and a defined adversary in the final confrontation between the forces of truth and falsehood. What the Job Satan performs in a courtroom, Belial enacts on a battlefield. The prosecutorial function has been completely absorbed into a different category of action. Accusation has become warfare. The court official has become a general. The Damascus document adds a further dimension that neither the community rule nor the War Scroll captures alone. Belial, it records, leads Israel astray through three nets: fornication, wealth, and defilement of the temple. This is not the testing of an individual's righteousness under controlled conditions with divine permission. This is a sustained historical strategy. The systematic corruption of an entire covenant community through the three specific vulnerabilities that the community's traditions had identified as its points of theological failure. The adversarial figure has acquired not just a military command, but a long-term program. He operates in history with strategic patience. The job Satan appears, performs a function, and departs. Belial is continuously present, continuously operating, continuously pursuing an agenda that extends across the whole sweep of Israel's covenant history. The name Belial is usually derived from Hebrew roots meaning worthlessness or wickedness. Belial, without profit or without assent. But the name may predate the theology built around it, a term that began as a descriptor for the base, and worthless ended as a cosmic title commanding eschatological armies. And the distance between those 2 points is the distance the adversarial office had traveled by the time the Qumran scrolls were written. Belial is not Mastema. This distinction must not be collapsed. Mastema petitions God and receives an explicit commission within a framework that still, however distantly, resembles the institutional structure of Job's divine court. His authority is delegated and specific. Belial becomes one pole of a sharply dualistic moral architecture, still within God's ultimate sovereignty, but no longer legible as a court official operating at divine discretion. Mastema asks permission, and it is granted. Belial's domain is not described as delegated in the Qumran texts. It is structural, inherent to the created moral order as Qumran theology understands it. One is an office holder with a commission. The other is a cosmological principle with a throne. And yet, even at this extreme, the furthest extension of the Hebrew adversarial tradition before the Christian synthesis reorganized it entirely, the Qumran texts insist on something that the later synthesis would quietly let go. Belial was created. The two spirits framework in the community rule does not present him as an eternal equal of God, as a self-existent principle of evil co-eternal with the divine. He was made. He operates within a structure God designed. He will be destroyed at the end of the eschatological war. The quasi-dualism of Qumran is functional rather than ontological, a cosmology that presents two operative principles governing human experience without claiming that those principles are metaphysically equivalent or independently originating. Belial is the outer limit of what the Hebrew tradition could do with the adversarial function. He is a cosmic principle. He is not yet a cosmic person with a biography. That step was left for the Christian synthesis to take. What these 3 chapters have assembled is not a catalog of obscure figures from marginal texts. It is a structural argument about what the adversarial function was in the entire period between the composition of Job and the emergence of Christian theology. In Job and Zechariah, the office is a legal role, performed at divine discretion by an agent who disappears when the function is complete. In 1 Chronicles, it is so close to divine will that 2 historians can substitute one for the other without comment. In Jubilees, it becomes a permanent appointment held by a being with his own genealogy and his own agenda. In Qumran, it becomes a cosmological principle with military authority and a long-term program for human corruption. The trajectory is consistent, and it ends not in any Hebrew text, but in the patristic synthesis that converted Belial's domain and Mastema's commission, and the job Satan's function, and the 5 beings from the previous episode into a single continuous biography with a single name. The Western Devil is not the discovery of who the adversary always was. It is the construction of who the adversary needed to be. By the end of this chapter, you will understand the 5 specific historical stages through which the adversarial office, combined with the figures from the previous episode, were compressed into one continuous personality. And you will understand what the tradition permanently surrendered at each stage of that compression, not as an accusation against those who carried it out, but as a precise account of what is no longer available to a theological tradition that has completed it. The first stage belongs to the second and first centuries before the Common Era, the period in which the texts examined in this episode were composed. 3 entirely distinct theological frameworks for the adversarial function were operating simultaneously in different communities, with no institutional pressure to harmonize them. The Enochic tradition had developed the Watchers, Azazel, and the Nephilim catastrophe as its primary account of evil's origin in the world. Embodied, collective, genealogical, with specific named perpetrators bearing specific forms of guilt. Jubilees had developed Mastema as a permanent adversarial commissioner, whose authority derived from a specific negotiated grant following a specific catastrophe. Qumran had developed Belial as a cosmological principle of darkness, commanding an eschatological army within a 2 spirits framework that governed all of human moral experience. These 3 frameworks were aware of each other. They borrowed vocabulary across boundaries, but they remained genuinely distinct, different communities, different theological agendas, different answers to overlapping questions. No text of this period attempts to reconcile them because reconciliation was not yet a theological requirement. Evil in the Jewish literature of the Second Temple period is plural, multiple origins, multiple agents, multiple frameworks operating in parallel without resolution. The second stage begins in the 1st century of the Common Era with the earliest strata of Christian literature. Wisdom of Solomon 2:24 marks an important threshold. Death is said to enter the world through the envy of a devil or adversary. The text does not yet give this figure a full biography. It does not explicitly name the serpent as Satan or invoke the Job-Satan's prosecutorial history. But it shows the Eden narrative and the adversarial figure beginning to move toward each other, the first traceable moment in the literary record where the ingredients of the later synthesis are in the same sentence. The job Satan's prosecutorial function is beginning to be retrospectively attributed to the being who operated in the garden. The adversarial office has begun to acquire a biography, stretching back to the moment of human origins. The third stage belongs to Origen and Tertullian in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. As established in episode 1 of this series, Isaiah 14's taunt against the king of Babylon, the song of Hallel ben Shachar, the Shining One, the Son of the Dawn, was a piece of political satire directed at a specific historical figure in a specific historical crisis. By writers such as Tertullian and Origen, Isaiah 14 was read as referring beyond the Babylonian king to the primordial fall of Satan. Jerome's Latin did not invent a demon named Lucifer. It rendered the morning star language with the Latin word Lucifer, light-bearer, ordinary Latin for the planet Venus at dawn. The translation was not absurd. The later mistake was treating that common noun as the devil's personal name and reading it back into a cosmic biography Jerome never intended to create. Mastema and Belial are not explicitly discussed in the patristic literature of this period. They are absorbed silently into the growing singular figure without theological discussion of what is being merged or what is being lost. The fourth stage belongs to Augustine in the 4th and 5th centuries. Augustine did not create the devil, but his theology of fallenness made the older prosecutorial framework increasingly difficult to maintain. A court official operating with divine permission, nearly interchangeable with divine will in the oldest texts, could not easily carry the weight of primordial rebellion, inherited corruption, and a drama of cosmic redemption requiring divine intervention. The adversarial office did not fit the architecture Augustine was building. So the architecture consumed it. The First Chronicles anomaly, God and Satan as interchangeable causes of the same event, became, in this framework, not a preserved theological complexity, but a difficulty requiring explanation. The texts that could not be harmonized with the singular adversary framework were not destroyed. They were made illegible, stripped of their original context, and made available only as raw material for the synthesis that had consumed them. The fifth stage is literary rather than theological, and it is perhaps the most consequential of all, precisely because it is not theological. Dante and Milton, writing within the Augustinian synthesis, but giving it imaginative form that no systematic theology could produce, did not create the singular devil, but they gave him unforgettable imaginative form. The Satan of Paradise Lost is not primarily a theological construct. He is a character, internally consistent, emotionally coherent, capable of generating reader identification and readerly sympathy in ways that Satan and Mastema and Belial simply were not designed to do, because they were never designed to be characters. They were designed to be functions, principles, and cosmological structures. What Milton did was give the synthesis a face so thoroughly imagined that it retrospectively felt ancient, as if Satan had always been this specific person with this specific psychology, and the ancient texts had been gesturing toward him all along. The synthesis was not a conspiracy. This framing is easy and it is wrong, and it is worth resisting clearly. The theologians who built this architecture were responding to genuine intellectual and institutional pressure. The pressure of maintaining coherent doctrine about the nature of evil within an increasingly defined monotheism. The pressure of explaining human suffering within a framework that attributed ultimate sovereignty to a good God. The pressure of producing theology that could be taught, defended, and institutionalized across a civilization. A singular omnipotent God opposed by a fragmented bureaucratic, institutionally embedded adversarial function is harder to teach and harder to build around than a singular omnipotent God opposed by a singular cosmic rebel whose defeat provides the narrative arc of salvation history. Origen and Tertullian and Augustine were not suppressing the truth for political convenience. They were solving problems, and they solved them by collapsing genuine distinctions into false unity. The cost was structural, and it was permanent within the tradition that completed the synthesis. The adversarial office framework, in which evil's presence in the governance of the world is institutional, proximate to divine will, distributed across multiple agents with multiple origins and multiple theological genealogies, provided resources for thinking about evil that the singular devil cannot replace. It provided a way to account for the adversarial function without requiring God's opposition to an equal and opposite cosmic force. It provided a way to hold the First Chronicles anomaly as a theological statement rather than a contradiction. It provided a way to think about Mastema's commission and Belial's domain as genuinely different theological problems, requiring genuinely different responses. When the office became a person, those resources were surrendered. The tradition gained a defeat condition. The cross defeats Satan. The end of history defeats Satan. It lost the capacity to think about evil as something other than personal, unified, intentional, and ultimately conquerable by opposing its commander. The prosecutorial Satan of Job, a crown prosecutor appearing in the divine court with God's full permission, performing a legitimate institutional function, departing without consequence when the session ends. The First Chronicles anomaly, an office so close to divine will that two different biblical historians could attribute the same act to God and to Satan in successive centuries, with neither text treating the substitution as a contradiction. Mastema, a named permanent holder of the adversarial commission, a being with his own origin in the aftermath of the Nephilim catastrophe, granted by petition the authority to afflict and lead astray. A third distinct being standing at the moment the office stopped rotating and started residing. Belial, one pole of a sharply dualistic moral architecture in Qumran theology, the adversarial function elevated to a cosmological principle, commanding armies against the sons of light. And from the previous episodes in this series, Samyaza, whose transgression was embodied and collective, Azazel, whose name appears in Leviticus 16 in the scapegoat ritual, where one goat is sacrificed to God, and a second goat, bearing the sins of Israel, is sent alive into the wilderness for Azazel. Gadriel, who the Enochic tradition names as the deceiver of Eve, and the reified morning star of Isaiah 14, a Latin noun that became a proper name that became a cosmic biography. Multiple distinct figures, multiple distinct theological frameworks, one name in the medieval imagination, one biography, one defeat condition applied to all of them. If the adversarial office was institutional, a prosecutorial function of the divine court operating with divine permission, so close to divine will that two texts could substitute one for the other without comment. Then what happened when the tradition replaced the office with a person? The Christian answer is coherent, and it carries enormous weight across centuries of theological history. Evil gained a face, a motivation, and a defeat condition. The cross defeats Satan. The end of history defeats Satan. Evil has a commander, and the commander can be identified, opposed, and ultimately overcome. That is not a trivial answer. It sustained one of the most consequential theological and institutional traditions in human history. And the people who built it were not fools or conspirators. They were responding to real questions with the best tools available to them. The Enochic answer, and the answer that the adversarial office framework, the first Chronicles anomaly, Mastema's commission, and Belial's domain all point toward, is that this framing is not a discovery, it is a decision. The tradition chose to construct a singular adversary because a singular adversary is coherent, teachable, and defeatable. And the construction required suppressing evidence that evil in the oldest available texts has no sovereign, that it is fragmented, bureaucratic, accidental, distributed across multiple independent traditions that were never designed to cohere, that arose from different catastrophes in different communities, answering different questions about why the world is the way it is. That is not a more complex version of the same hope. It is a different account of what hope requires.